Welcome to the People and Supply Chains podcast, where we share the best strategies to help you take control of your supply chain to reduce costs and improve customer experience. My name is David Andrews, your host. Thank you for joining us. We are, of course, at our homes during this COVID-19 crisis, and we're hoping that you are all staying safe as well. I'm here with Jeff Tawney. He leads the truckload operations and client solution teams at eShipping. Jeff, thank you so much for being here. You have 25 years of great experience in the industry. You've worked with some of the largest shippers in the United States. So thank you so much for joining us, man.
Great to be here. Thank you, David.
So in this episode, we're talking about the 3 ways to pandemic-proof your full truckload and logistics program. Obviously, there's been a lot of, lack of a better word, chaos across multiple industries, and this is nothing new now. And Jeff, I'd love to hear your perception of what's happening and how individuals and shippers and businesses can combat these challenges that are being affected. Let's start with the economic challenges, and what are you seeing the effects on specifically the truckload market?
Yeah, thanks, David. It's been a really interesting truckload market over these last, month and a half, almost 2 months. A couple of things. When COVID first hit, it was interesting. We were already in a bit of a down market in truckload, right? If you come off the spikes of, late 2017, 2018, and then we started seeing it come down in 2019. But when COVID hit, we saw some substantial spikes out of the gate. And that was driven by a few things, right? We're all familiar with the rush on, certain CPG items. But then we also saw some shippers trying to push out inventory, ahead of a shelter-in-place order. So we saw those spikes happening, and they were relatively short-lived. And then we saw an immediate drop in the truckload market. And I would say over the last couple of weeks, we're starting to see that stabilize, but that drop was pretty substantial. It's been really interesting. When we've had, these supply chain disruptions and things that have happened in industry, what makes COVID a little bit unique, I think, is that it's affected also, there's different things happening with supply and with demand. Meaning, right, you've got certain items that there's a strong demand for, and then you've got other items where there's just not the supply to hit them, or it's just an imbalance of supply and demand, which makes this one a little bit unique. And now we're seeing a pretty good stabilization, as far as carrier rates after coming down. And there's definitely a lot of things happening in the carrier network right now. A lot of carriers, they set up their own internal networks based on certain shippers, performing as normal. And so a number of carriers we also saw had severe lane imbalances. So if you think about like a retail space, right, where you had stores closing, so you have carriers that a specific, part of their network was basically shut down. So they're servicing food and beverage in another lane, but using retail to position their equipment. So we've seen those lane imbalances also, have a negative effect on how some of the carriers are servicing.
Lots of different things going on. The lanes, it's starting to level out, is what you said. I wouldn't expect anything different for these challenges to come when things spike and dip, right? Within specific supply chains of shippers, what are your customers telling you? What are you seeing? How is it affecting the greater whole of their business?
Yeah, so when it comes to that, it's really different by different shippers that we work with, and so I think it's hard to give just a broad blanket answer there. But if you start looking at inventory, so a shipper that may have, inventory is going to be a thing that I think we're going to be hearing quite a bit about over the next several weeks and months about how people are positioning inventory. So if you look at, the item, look at a channel that maybe had strong demand, from an inventory perspective, they may have had a strategy where they warehouse a certain amount of items, and now we're seeing maybe more of them go plant direct because, one, they've exhausted maybe inventory within a node in their supply chain, and now they're going plant direct. And some of them have also narrowed their SKU base so that they can keep up with demand. You can see that if you go to the grocery store, you may not notice as many different flavors or variety of whatever you might buy. And some of that is just to keep up with demand. So inventory is definitely one of them, and it really is. It's going to be interesting for the folks that have more seasonal type inventory that may have brought in seasonal inventory, and ready for an April distribution. There's going to be some inventory challenges there as another season is coming in. Specifically, take apparel as an example, but there's other seasonal businesses out there. They're used to a certain set schedule, and now all of a sudden we're looking at it's back to school time almost. So now what am I going to do with that inventory? Am I going to speed it up, slow it down? How am I going to manage that? So I think that's one of the things that I think a lot about when we're working with our shippers and how they're positioned and understanding, the inventory within their network, not just their own, but also their suppliers as well.
Right. I can imagine that inventory, it's been up and down, and you might not have the suppliers to order the inventory because they're either shut down or they're delayed or whatever the case may be. I can imagine how chaotic that could be for some shippers within specific industries.
Yeah, you're spot on. And, there's been a number of information out there in publications and such, but there's definitely seems to be a sense of more folks considering, nearshoring, supply strategies versus purely Asia-based supply strategies, because it's been really interesting, and the markets have been out of whack, right? So when we had, imports largely dry up and shipping dry up on the West Coast, we saw, substantial rate spikes going into the West Coast, largely because there was the West Coast, which is suddenly this pretty nice head haul market, is now became a backhaul market. So this just speaks to that volatility that you were mentioning earlier.
So we have three simple or ideas for shippers to help pandemic-proof their truckload and logistics program. As we continue to go down this world of uncertainty, these are very simple tips that I know you have come up with, and some ideas that might help shippers, better help stabilize what's happening within their business in their logistics program. So I'd like to go through those three right now.
Sure.
The first one is combating market volatility. There's some ways that we can combat this, right? And there's shifts that we're seeing. There's some tips and ideas that we can do to make sure that we stabilize the ship as markets go up and down and dip and all sorts of things happen. What are ways, or first of all, let's start, what are you seeing as far as market volatility goes, Jeff?
Yeah, so again, we talked about the early spike and then a decline, and we've seen it been relatively flat. And depending on your projection, I think most people are now realizing that this isn't going to be a V-shaped return where all of a sudden there's this big demand. It might be more of a slow increased demand, and we're seeing that as states start opening up. So volatility is still there, as some of these lane imbalances are there, but it's definitely not to the extent we saw just a few weeks ago. And again, the supply demand constraints I'll share out there, but from a volatility standpoint, it's definitely dropped, but it seems to be stabilized. We're seeing a few lanes, David, that we're seeing a little more volatility as demand returns, but in general, not to the degree we saw several weeks ago.
Yeah, so unpredictable truckload lanes, right? Would that be a correct categorization?
Yes, and I think, if you look at the last 3 years, this has been a pretty interesting truckload environment, just, supply chain environment in general, just the volatility we've seen. And it's almost becoming a normal, so to speak. And it's knowing, like, how do you react when that volatility happens? And I think it goes back to what your overall transportation strategy is. Right.
So then what can our audience do about the market volatility? There might be a couple things like maintaining daily reporting, highlighting at-risk shipments, requesting customers to create shipment volume forecasts by lane. Like, what are some things that shippers can actively do to combat market volatility?
Yeah, good question. And I will tell you, a lot of this, would be customized by shipper and what their objectives are. So we have some folks that we work with that they want more predictability and cost on their supply chain. But then all of a sudden you see a market drop, and now they want to ride, the wave of the spot market, so to speak. So as an example, I think one of the first things to do is assess what is your real strategy when you're looking at your market and how you want your transportation expense to be managed. We work with customers on a hybrid approach many times. that, hey, now might be a good time to, this is an ideal target for more of a contract pricing longer term, if that meets your objectives. And then we have some, especially with the lower market, that want to try to, ride the wave, so to speak, and are willing to take on a little more risk. It comes and goes, but you're spot on. I think a lot of it comes down to what they can do to combat it is make sure that they're engaged with their carriers, or their partners like an eShipping, to help understanding what's happening in the market, how that aligns with their strategy. And then I think also just to understand, who you're working with. I know that sounds like a very basic comment, but it's important to understand the carriers you're working with. How diversified are they? What % of the business are you to them, and vice versa? And how are they financially? So, to combat this volatility, it'll be interesting coming out of this, right? So we talked about Class 8 tractor sales are down substantially, most since 2009, coming out of the recession. And follow that period, we also, if you look back to that 2009 period, there was a substantial number of carriers that went out of business. So to combat volatility, I would assess, my current carrier mix, make sure they're financially viable, understand how they fit, how my freight fits in their network. That certainly helps from from managing the volatility a bit. If it fits nicely within their network. And, we've seen things in these last days where, from a cash flow standpoint, there are some shippers that, are looking at extending terms or maybe doing other things. That's going to have a very negative effect on a lot of these carriers. And so if you're in partner with a carrier that might be highly leveraged or not, that might be something that you might want to, look at, because that could create a challenge, right, coming out of this in the near future.
So that's market volatility. The second part is carrier capacity. What are you seeing in the market? What shifts and challenges? What disruptions are going on within the truckload capacity? Because I know capacity has been a topic for many years, at least I've seen online and individuals talk about, right? And so you're kind of like, okay, where's capacity even before COVID hit? But now, once COVID hit, really what's happening out there, Jeff? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so I think in general, carrier capacity is fairly available, I would say. Again, we talked a little bit about the carriers' networks and being out of balance. However, we finding capacity is relatively well available. So from a shift, we're seeing, tender acceptance is high. In general, I'd say it depends on how, on what segment you might be looking at and your freight characteristics. But in general, with less demand, carrier capacity is actually pretty stable now, and actually it's in a much better position than it was, say, 6 months ago.
That's great to hear. So what are some ways, even with it being more stable, are we just talking about traditional, capacity best practices here, or is there anything else that we might need to think about?
Yeah. Again, I would go from a capacity standpoint. I would recommend that you really assess your own network. And when you're looking at carrier capacity, actually looking at how you're engaging with those carriers, who you're engaging with, and actually also looking at your network and are there opportunities. I think it's always a good opportunity to do this, but between different modal shifts, right? Is intermodal an opportunity? And really assessing, even utilization of equipment. One of the best ways to help reduce transportation costs is actually to try to limit the activity, whether that is more utilization within equipment or whether that's reduced miles, whatever it is. And that's a strength of ours, David, in partnering with eShipping, is that we've taken a holistic view of your network and actually looking at the transactions and the activities taking place, to see if there's any opportunity to reduce that, which in turn decreases possibly your need on carrier capacity.
A lot of creative ways there to do that, Jeff. And we actually have a PDF called The 3 Ways to Pandemic Proof Your Truckload and Logistics Program, which is actually in a PDF form. So everything that we're talking about here is downloadable, and we'll put that in the show notes. The last thing is service levels.
Yes.
Service levels. Broad term here, but what are you seeing regarding carriers within their service levels, making sure shipments deliver on time, safely, that type of thing?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're seeing tender acceptance up pretty high on time, and with less demand and more capacity in the market right now, we're certainly seeing service levels increase slightly. They've been relatively good actually for the last at least 6 months or so, but they've actually been relatively good from a service level standpoint. I think when I think about service levels, I think one of the other things to think about is just to continue to assess what you're measuring. There's certainly the basics, the on-time delivery, and just make sure that it's meaningful for your organization. But from our standpoint, service is actually performing very well right now. And so that's, again, I think that flows a little bit with carrier capacity.
Are there any ways that we can be proactive to make sure that we're maintaining those levels? You said that it's not a massive issue, but maybe for some markets it might be. Is there any ideas that we can execute on to maintain those levels, or to maybe increase those levels?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a number of things, right? So we talked about, a number of things earlier, right? But one of the things, there's the term out there called being a shipper of choice, right? Unfortunately, that sometimes comes, becoming a shipper of choice when the market's tight. But it's always applicable when it comes down to service levels, right? How is your operation as far as for drivers to be able to come, easily access and exit without any type of significant detention or hassle? We're seeing some changes, right, with COVID, where there's new policies and new regulations. So from a service side, the more you can be transparent with carriers as far as communicating any new COVID-related type requirements you may have at your facility will help. So the drivers know what to prepare for ahead of time. That's been a pretty fluid situation, David. Some requirements are changing here and there. Other things from a capacity standpoint, what a shipper can do, and we talked a little bit about this in the PDF that you mentioned, is just engaging your partner and helping them with forecasting and planning. Those hours are crucial for a carrier to try to set up their network and align a driver in order to ensure a timely pickup and a timely delivery. So I think just that carrier engagement, providing forecasting, talking to your partner. I mean, there's still a number of shippers that are doing pickups same day. We understand sometimes that's absolutely a requirement, but sometimes there's an opportunity to provide more notice, which certainly will reflect positively in service.
I love it. It's being proactive. It's making sure that you keep open lines with communication with every vendor of yours to make sure that you know what's going to happen and you can be there to assist and to make sure all the supply chain is running smoothly. That's fantastic. Well, hey, Jeff, thank you so much for being on the People in Supply Chains podcast. We appreciate all your tips. Jeff, where can they find you? Can we find you on LinkedIn? Can we email you? What can we do if we have any other questions to reach out?
Absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm fairly accessible, and feel free to reach out to me there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Hey, for everyone listening, make sure to go give us 5 stars on the Spotify and Apple podcast, wherever you're listening, here on YouTube. Give us a thumbs up and please subscribe. Thank you so much, Jeff. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Great. Thank you, David. Appreciate the time.